All right, welcome back to another one of our fun-filled online lectures. In this video, we're going to pick up the story a little bit more on some of the other issues that were tearing the country apart as we get into the 1800s and closer to the Civil War. Now, if you remember in the last video that you saw, we talked about things like changing industry in the North, the push by Southern slave owners to try to get more land in the West for cotton, the fact that a lot of Northerners were trying to move west to get what they called free soil, land where slavery wouldn't be allowed to expand. We saw like the social changes that were happening in the North as we got these factories with the new middle class that came out that wants to reform everybody. And now the fact is, it's time to look at the crucial issue in this whole mess. Of course, not everything that caused the Civil War was about slavery. Slavery was not the only cause of the Civil War, but it was a major one. I would say it was the main cause of the Civil War. So in the next two films that you guys will watch, this one I want to talk about the growing anti-slavery movement in the North. And then in the next one, to be fair, we also have to let the South talk to us. If the North is going to start to criticize slavery, we have to let the South tell us why slavery is awesome. So be ready for that. It's hard to see, but it's something we have to acknowledge. The other thing we have to talk about in this film is the fact that while a growing anti-slavery movement was taking root in the North, there were a lot of people who started to say, hey, slaves have no rights in this country. Well, guess what? Women don't have a heck of a lot of rights in this country before the Civil War either. So there's a growing women's movement that we also have to acknowledge, because as we look at the Civil War, its causes, its events, women are going to play a massive role in this country during the war, and we have to be prepared to talk about that. But to do this justice, there's one key thing we have to look at to get started, and that is something that you probably never heard of in your whole life, okay? So let me start here. I don't know if you've ever been channel surfing on a Sunday morning and seen some of these, what you want to call televangelist programs, you know, the guys who are on TV in a church, and they're getting all fired up about Jesus. They always say Jesus. They never say Jesus, right? They get all real fired up about God and their message of healing, faith, and they're trying to fire up their crowd. I know usually on the bottom of these TV shows there's a 1-800 number because, yeah, they want your money too. But the main thing is these televangelists are trying to convert people to a message. And they do it in a way that has them fired up. They're trying to fire up their audience. They're not being calm and reserved because they want their audience fired up about their religious message. Okay, so think about watching one of those shows on a Sunday morning and imagine somebody that fired up standing under a big white tent on the outskirts of some small city in the North in the 1830s or the 1840s, around the same time that we were going through all those changes with the factories that we talked about last time. What you've got in the 1830s and 40s in America, mostly in the northern states, is a massive religious revival that historians call the Second Great Awakening. Now, guys, if they call it the Second Great Awakening, you know what that means. There must have been a first one. Don't worry, we're not going to talk about the first one. Forget it. As far as you're concerned, it never happened. But the Second Great Awakening in the 1830s and 40s was massive. It led to this huge religious revival in the North. And the message was pretty simple. The preachers who stood under these big white tents on the outskirts of town and had hundreds of people come and listen to them rant and rave about God said, hey, guys, it's time to clean this country up. You've got to hear this message of faith. You can lead a good life. You can do good deeds on earth to help you get into heaven. But you've got to leave this tent meeting, and you've got to get other people to join this cause too. And these preachers said we had to do it now. We had to awaken our souls now, because I don't know if you know much about the Bible, and it's okay if you don't. I don't presume that anyone watching this is a Christian or an atheist or anything. But according to Christians, in the last book of the Bible, they read about this belief that Jesus Christ is coming back for the second coming at some point, and he's going to separate the righteous from the wicked. Well, according to these preachers in the Second Great Awakening in the 1830s and 40s, that second coming of Jesus was going to be real soon. And they believed that they had a duty to clean this country up before that happened. It's kind of like, you know, when the holidays come, Thanksgiving, Christmas, and you've got company coming to stay with you, you got to clean the house up. You don't want your company to see how you live most of the time because they'd be kind of embarrassed and you'd be embarrassed. So you clean the house up a little bit. You know, you sweep up a little bit so they don't think you live in squalor. These preachers said, hey, Jesus is coming back. We got to clean this country up. we've got drunkenness, we've got a lack of education, and you don't have to think too hard to think about this. These white, northern, middle-class reformers who have already shown up as we've got more industry in the north, as we've talked about, if they're going to look at all the social problems in this country that they said need to be cleaned up right now, you can probably guess what their number one target's going to be. It's going to be slavery. The reason that the anti-slavery movement in America took off as strongly as it did about 30 or so years before the Civil War was almost directly tied to the fact that a lot of these reformers who wanted to attack slavery got fired up at religious revivals like this, who believed that they had to clean up the country right now because Jesus was going to come back soon and they had to fix all these problems. So a lot of the anti-slavery movement was religious in its origin. Not everybody was religious, but it's a part of it. And maybe it helps you understand why they were so fired up the way they were. But the thing is, if you're going to look at this anti-slavery movement in America before the Civil War, you can't oversimplify it. So I want you to think about a couple of terms here. You can say, okay, I'm anti-slavery. That means I'm against slavery. But there were a lot of ways that you could say you were anti-slavery. The strongest movement to try to end slavery in America before the Civil War was called the Abolition movement. If you were an abolitionist, you were part of the abolition movement. And abolition is a real simple word to understand. If there's something I want to abolish, that means I want to end it right now. I want it to be done today. If you were an abolitionist in America before the Civil War, you wanted slavery ended right away. And these abolitionists were pretty hardcore. They didn't just want to end slavery and then send the slaves off to cast off and do whatever they wanted to do. These abolitionists said, we as a country have to end slavery today, and we have to give these former slaves full equal rights. You don't have to think too hard to realize just how few white people in America before the Civil War were willing to go that far. So you had a lot of people who said, okay, I don't like slavery, I'm against it, but God, ending it right now and giving black people full equal rights, that's crazy. That's what some people thought. So you had some people who said, well, let's end it gradually. You know, maybe if you're a slave adult now, hey, too bad, but once all the children who are slaves turn 18, maybe we'll set them free. There were proposals like that. Some people said maybe we'll raise money and we'll pay slave owners for their trouble to end slavery. If there was a gradual idea like that. These abolitionists were pretty hardcore, and they were really in the minority at first. One way to think about it is, I bet you could imagine that there were a lot of black abolitionists throughout the history of the United States, way before this Second Great Awakening and the emergence of all this white anti-slavery talk in the 1820s and 30s and 40s. Black people, slaves or free blacks, wanted slavery to end. It's obvious why. It took a while for white people to get on board with this movement. It's kind of like, this is kind of a cheesy analogy, but when I ask people to tell me about some really famous early rock and roll singers, maybe you've heard of Elvis Presley from the 1950s. Yeah, Elvis didn't invent rock and roll. He was just the first famous white guy who sang rock music. He took music that was mostly African-American, the blues, jazz, and made it popular to white audiences. Or another way to think about it is if you're a rap fan or a hip-hop fan, one of the most famous rappers of the last 10, 15 years, 20 years is Eminem. He's white. Eminem even says, hey, I'm popular because I'm white. If I was black, I would only have sold half as much music, right? Sometimes there are African Americans who lead the way in some movements, and it doesn't really get popular as a movement until white people get involved, because that's when other white people start to pay attention. Sorry, that's the way the country has functioned for a long time. And it's no different in the anti-slavery movement. If you wanted to see white people who spoke out against slavery in the beginning of the country, they weren't talking about ending slavery and giving full rights to black people. They were taking a more modest step. I'll give you an example. What you've got on your screen right now is a representation of something called the American Colonization Society. Its name might give you a hint as to what it was talking about, but if you want to look for the roots of this group, a lot of white people, a lot of really famous white people in early America joined this group. I don't know if you've heard of like James Madison or James Monroe, a couple of early American presidents who joined this group. These guys said, yeah, slavery's wrong. We don't like slavery. It's morally evil and all that. But they also, let's be honest, they were kind of racist. And they said, yeah, we don't like slavery, but If we end it, we also don't want black people living around us. I'm not lying, that's what they thought. So the name American Colonization Society might give you a hint as to what they wanted to do. They didn't want slavery to continue, but they didn't want the former slaves living in this country. And it might shock you to learn that one member of this group, when he was a young man, was Abraham Lincoln, who you might have been raised to think of as this huge abolitionist believer in racial equality. He wasn't that way when he was a young man. We'll see him change over time. So all these politicians, all these white guys in power said, yeah, slavery is wrong, but let's colonize black people. And think about it. Where could we send former slaves so they wouldn't live in America anymore? Oh, I know. And this is what the American Colonization Society said. Let's send them to Africa. Actually, the way a lot of them phrased it was, let's send them back to Africa. They said, we're going to raise money. We will go down to slave states. We'll buy a bunch of slaves from their masters. We'll put them on a ship and send them back to Africa. We'll walk up to free black people in cities and say, hey, here's some money. Get on a ship back to Africa. I bet you can imagine how that's going to go over. If you're watching this video, let's say you have German ancestry, okay? And if I walk up to you with a lot of cash and say, hey, here's a bunch of money. Why don't you get on a plane and go back to Germany? You'd probably smack me. I guess you probably weren't born in Germany. You probably don't speak fluent German. Your ancestors were from Germany, but you're not, right? Most slaves and free black people in America by the 1830s, they weren't born in Africa. Telling them to go back to Africa, they would laugh or get angry, justifiably, right? Heck, one of the things the American Colonization Society did was they bought a chunk of real estate in Western Africa. They bought it up, they called it Liberia, like liberty being a connected word to Liberia. And they said, okay, black people, here's some money. Go live in Liberia. Go move back to Africa. Yeah, you can imagine how this went. I don't care if you know this number, but it always sticks with me. In the 1820s, which is the first full decade that this group was pretty powerful, the African-American population of this country grew by something like 120,000. And only 1,200 black people were sent to live in Liberia by the American Colonization Society. Most people laugh this off, but it was white people, well-intentioned, saying slavery is evil, let's get rid of it. We just don't want to have to live around them. That's about as far as a lot of powerful white people were willing to go in the early 1800s. On the flip side, though, oh man, free black people, you may not be able to read the whole thing, the video's in the way, but free blacks were, I'm saying, they were harsh critics of this colonization idea. Understandably so. Saying, oh, why don't you go back to Africa? They're like, hey, I'm not from Africa. If I can give you an example, this little pamphlet that's here on your screen was written by a free black man in Boston named David Walker. David Walker says, colonization is crap. I shouldn't have to go back to Africa. He wrote this pamphlet called, it's got a longer title, but it was sort of summed up as an appeal to the colored citizens of the world. He was really writing to white people as much. And white people who read this got freaked out because he said two things that scared the heck out of white people who read this. And that really inspired black people who read it. One thing he said was, hey, guess what? This country belongs just as much, if not more, to black people than it does to white people. And you can think about why he might say that. He'd say, hey, guys, guess what? We're the ones doing all the work. All the slaves in the plantations, they're doing all the work. You just sit there and you count your profits while we do the labor and you don't have to pay us. This country belongs to us. We're the reason you're so rich. Oh, and guess what? Here's another direct quote from this pamphlet that scared the heck out of white people. Woe be unto you if we have to obtain our freedom by fighting. Dude, he's threatening outright violent rebellion if slavery isn't ended peacefully. But white people are like, oh, I don't know. I might lose some friends if I criticize slavery. I'm afraid to talk about it. Saying you were anti-slavery or even more radical, an abolitionist among white people at the time, they would think you were nuts. Some of them wouldn't even talk to you anymore. They'd certainly argue with you. And so it took just a few people to really popularize this movement. And then they were kind of on the fringes, to be honest with you. Let me just give you a sample. I guess you could call this next guy, maybe you could call him the Elvis or the Eminem of the abolitionist movement, although he doesn't quite look as cool as Eminem or Elvis. But William Lloyd Garrison, hardcore guy. He was a journalist in Boston. And he got arrested one day in the late 1820s because he wrote an article saying that owner of a textile factory in Boston, textile factory processes cotton into cloth, right? He said this owner of a textile factory in Boston was benefiting from the existence of slavery. Basically said this factory owner wants slavery to continue. The factory owner sued him for slander and Garrison got thrown in prison. Just between you and me, he was probably right. This factory owner made more money because of slavery because his cotton was cheaper. But while Garrison spent just 7 weeks in prison after this lawsuit, he said, I was in prison for 7 weeks and I had no rights in that time. I was behind bars. But as I sat there, I thought the slave is figuratively behind bars for his entire life. He won't get out in 7 weeks. I will. And he said that time I spent in prison convinced me that I had to really get stronger in my opposition to slavery. So he started publishing a newspaper called The Liberator, and he's going to publish this all the way through the Civil War about the evils of slavery and the need for racial equality. And he wasn't going to be quiet about it. I want you guys to check out this quotation that's showing up here. This showed up at the top of every issue of The Liberator. It's what you call a masthead. And I'm not going to make you memorize the quotation. But, take a second and read this thing. This is not the words of someone who is going to say what he thinks, and then you can decide if you agree with him or not. He's saying, I'm going to tell you how it is. I'm going to tell you what I feel, and you're going to have to deal with it. And I'm going to be loud, and I'm going to be in your face, and you're going to have to accept it. And as he spoke out against slavery and wrote against slavery, he got some recruits to his cause, but he also upset a lot of people. He was in Boston. A lot of abolitionists in Boston, but he got attacked. He got beaten up. He got dragged through the streets of town at least once, tied to the legs of a horse. I mean, he got attacked like crazy. And to be fair, some of his tactics were not necessarily aimed at winning friends. I mean, one thing he would do after some of his speeches is he would hold up a copy of the United States Constitution. He would call it America's Agreement with Hell, and he would set it on fire. Not a lot of people liked watching the Constitution burn. Now, Garrison said he did it because, as we've said, the Constitution protected the rights of slave owners. Remember that 3/5 compromise that counted slaves as 3/5 of a person so southern states could get more power in Congress? Or the part that said, if you're a fugitive slave and you run away, anyone who finds you, even in a northern state where slavery is banned, has to return you or they're guilty of theft. That protected the rights of slave owners. And Garrison said, this is an agreement with hell, and he would burn this thing. And he won some followers for his radical stance. He won a lot more enemies. But people at least were paying attention to this message of the evils of slavery. And some people said, okay, Garrison's crazy, we can ignore him. But one by one, more white Americans, and especially a lot of black Americans, started getting more vocal. And I'll give you an example of one instance that really made the country decide to pay attention to this issue. There was a white minister at a church out in Illinois named Reverend Elijah Lovejoy. And Reverend Lovejoy was a big fan of Garrison's. He subscribed to The Liberator. And Reverend Lovejoy started publishing his own abolitionist newsletter in his own printing press that he owned on his property in Illinois. And a bunch of times Reverend Lovejoy would come home and he'd find his printing press just destroyed. Angry white folks in rural Illinois didn't take kindly to this guy talking about how slavery was wrong, because they were, let's be honest, pretty racist. So a bunch of times Reverend Lovejoy would rebuild his printing press and he'd publish more articles about the evils of slavery. So one day he came home and his printing press wasn't just destroyed, there were people waiting for him, and they killed him. And now you've got a white man, and not just any white man, a white minister, kill over slavery. And the country's like, whoa, white people are killing each other over slavery? Maybe we need to decide where we stand on this. That kind of thing made them wake up more. And Garrison got more vocal. And Garrison got more followers. And he got more people who started joining him up. He got other abolitionists on his side. And I'll just give you a few examples of, well, let's start with some of the white people that he got on his side. Obviously, you would need African Americans, former slaves in the movement too. But just as a taste of some of the other ways you could oppose slavery and the experiences that Garrison tried to bring into his movement, here's a pair of sisters, the Grimke sisters. who grew up on a slave plantation. Their mother and father were really wealthy slave owners in the South. And as Sarah and Angelina grew up, they got in arguments with their parents about how wrong they thought slavery was, until they finally abandoned their mother and father, left home, and moved to Boston and joined Garrison's movement. And you can think about this, why Garrison would want them to join the cause to fight against slavery. They've seen it. You know, Garrison, sitting in Boston, believes slavery is evil. The Grimke sisters would say, we've seen slavery. We've seen how slaves are treated on plantations. We can speak from our experience, witnessing what our father did to his slaves, to human beings that he called property. And as another example, I don't care if you know this guy, but there was another white abolitionist in the North named Wendell Phillips who decided, I'm not just going to speak out against slavery. I'm not just going to write against slavery. He decided he was going to never in his life wear anything made of cotton, or eat any sugar, or smoke any tobacco, because those were the three biggest cash crops produced on slave plantations in America. And other people joined his cause. Boycotts can have a big impact if you want to change people's behavior. And that's all great, boycotting, speaking, writing. But these are, let's be honest, these are white people criticizing an institution that they don't necessarily have any firsthand experience of. You can even witness slavery without being a slave. Garrison wanted to get African Americans and former slaves in his movement. And this man, Frederick Douglass, has to be, I would say, the most famous former slave in American history. See, Douglass was born a slave in Maryland, and he ran away when he was a young man. The thing about Douglass was true of a lot of African Americans in the country, especially slaves and former slaves. Douglass had what they used to call mixed parentage, okay? His mother was black, his father was white. You can think about how that would have happened on a slave plantation. But Douglass ran away from home, and he moved to Boston. He met William Lloyd Garrison. He joined his movement. And the thing about Douglass that anyone who saw him speak would say, even if they hated him, even if they didn't like his message, was they all agreed he was an amazing speaker. And I can't do him justice. I can't do his voice justice. I will say, there's some great videos out there of Douglass, of people, of famous actors reading Frederick Douglass's speeches that you could check out. One thing he used to do in a lot of his speeches, he would start off saying, I stand before you this evening a thief, a robber. I stole these arms, my legs, this head from my master, ran off with them. Just think about it. To a slave owner, what's a slave? Property. Douglass is pointing out the irony or the ridiculousness of saying that I, as a human being, am someone else's property by the law, and that running away from this man made me a fugitive, made me someone who broke the law. They were shocked by this hypocrisy, right? And so Douglass would give these speeches, and he was very eloquent. Some people were so racist, they said they couldn't believe that he had ever even been a slave. Or they said, well, he's so intelligent simply because he's got a white father. I mean, that's what some people said, right? But in his speeches, he stressed what he believed about the evils of slavery. And he wasn't just trying to criticize slave owners. He went after everybody. He went after the whole country. This quotation speaks volumes because America is supposed to be a republic, right? A republic is a government where we elect representatives to speak for us in the Capitol. And Douglass said, this is not a republic as long as we have slavery. There are millions of Americans who have no voice, who don't have representatives speaking for them. It's a sham. You call yourselves human beings, forget it. A base pretense means you're lying to yourselves if you call yourselves human beings. You're owning other humans. How human can you be? You call yourselves Christian. You're not Christian. You're owning people. You're beating other human beings. That's him talking. And so people said, well, I don't believe he was even a slave. He's too intelligent. Well, Garrison says, Douglass, prove them wrong. Douglass wrote his autobiography. It's called A Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. And it is worth reading. It's pretty short, too. Check it out sometime. And the thing about Douglass that I want to mention is here he is legally, when he got his career started as an abolitionist, he was a fugitive, right? And by the law, his master, his old master from Maryland, could have tracked him down and brought him before a court and made him be taken back to slavery. So Douglass traveled the country, getting more popular, seeking out donations. At one point, he even went to England. And I should mention this now, it'll matter. England ended slavery in all of their colonies in the early 1830s. Keep that in mind. So Douglass went to England, and he raised a lot of money from sympathetic people too. And he came back home, and he took all this money he had raised from his audience, and he sent a big bunch of cash down to his former master in Maryland. He bought his own freedom. And the master says, fine, I'll take the money, rather than, you know, going through all the mess of hunting you down. I'll take the money and just get out of my life, basically is what he said. And so you've got Garrison, excuse me, the Grimke sisters, Phillips, Douglass, countless other people getting involved in this movement. And they're speaking and they're writing against it. And that's great. But other people said, we need to be more active. And I'm assuming that you've heard of something called the Underground Railroad. I think that's a fair assumption. Now, I'm also assuming that you know it's not really a system of tunnels and trains. Okay, the Underground Railroad was a secretive network designed to help slaves escape plantations in the South and make their way towards freedom in the North. And you check out this map, and you can see all the slave states in the South, and the fact that as they fled to the North, these white lines in the green states and the free states in the North were some of the major networks, some of the major routes that were taken to help slaves escape to freedom. And if you know this, Michigan, just as one example, has a lot of networks in the southern part of the state. You can see where most of these networks end up. Right? And as they're doing this, as they're taking these slaves and helping them escape to freedom, the reason they call it the Underground Railroad is they would use like jargon or lingo from the railroad industry to try to cover up what they were doing. So if I own a house that's going to open my, say, my basement or my attic to runaway slaves overnight, then my house is a station. I'm a station master. If I'm someone who grabs a lantern and helps escape slaves through the woods to the next station, I'm the conductor, right? You get the idea. And you try to keep it all secret. So if I'm a station master and I'm housing fugitive slaves in my basement or my attic overnight, all I know is where to send them tomorrow. I know where they're going to be next. I don't know where they were yesterday. I don't know where they will be in 2 days. It's to keep this network as secret as possible as Southern slave owners and their hired bounty hunters try to catch these runaways all throughout the North. And the fact is, if you look at this network, most of these lines go up into Canada. Remember what I said a minute ago about England ending slavery in all of their colonies? Canada was an English possession. Slavery was abolished in Canada by 1833. If you could make it all the way to Canada, your former owner had no right to claim you. He could not come into Canada to get you back. And thousands of slaves escaped along the Underground Railroad, sneaking through along Detroit, up through, you know, upstate New York, up through New England to get up into Canada. And that's powerful. You've got people literally risking their lives to help slaves run away. But a lot of movements that are trying to change society run into trouble when they can't all agree on their next move. And I want to point this out because it'll help us understand some other issues a little later on as we get closer to the Civil War. Anytime there's a group of people who want to change society, some of them want to be more radical, more aggressive. Other people say, well, we should do this more slowly. You know, let's take our time. We don't want to freak anybody out. And there's usually a split like that. Well, in this abolitionist movement, by 1840, they split sort of down the middle. And I want you to be able to understand this. So I want to talk about it for a second. And to do that, I hate to say this, but we have to get political for a second. There have usually been two major political parties in America. The names change sometimes, what the parties stand for change, or sometimes flip between parties sometimes. But if you went back to the decades before the Civil War, the two major parties were the Democrats and the Whigs, okay? I don't care if you know necessarily what they stood for or who they represented, but both of these parties had some supporters who were slave owners. Both of these parties had some supporters who opposed slavery. And so to get as many votes as possible, no Democrat or Whig was going to stand up in a speech and 100% oppose or support slavery. They would lose votes either way, right? And the fact is, most politicians were trying to appeal to as many people as they possibly could. So some abolitionists said, well, politicians aren't going to help us. Politicians are just out for votes. They won't risk their lives, political careers, by supporting a movement as radical as ours. So just to use an example, William Lloyd Garrison and some other abolitionists said, we can't work with politicians. They aren't going to listen to us. No, the best way to get our message across and to get people to support us is to recruit women to speak out against slavery. And if you're thinking, why? Women couldn't even vote back then, and that's true. Think about this. Even some people in modern America feel this way, but definitely before the Civil War, there was a belief that, kind of like what we talked about before with those separate spheres, that men did things like business and politics, and women stayed home and cooked and cleaned and raised the kids. And somehow people believed that women, females, were somehow naturally more full of morality. They were somehow more kind and moral people. And you can believe that or don't, it's up to you. But a guy like Garrison said, if women are so moral, if women have so much more morality than men, let's let women speak out against the evils of slavery, and then the audience will say, wow, if these women think slavery is evil, and they're so full of morality, maybe I should change my mind. Some people said that, right? But the fact is, other abolitionists said, no, you're crazy, Garrison. And here's the two things they looked at. Some of these people said, you know, having women speak out in our movement would actually do us more harm than good. Because as we've said, the belief at the time was women are supposed to stay home. They're not supposed to speak out in public. They're not supposed to enter that public sphere. So some people believed the more we have women speak in public, the more it's going to hurt our cause. People will take us less seriously if women speak out. So they said, no, the thing we got to do is we got to get active in politics. And if the Democrats and the Whigs are both going to ignore us, then we got to do what people ever since then have done every now and then when they think the two major parties aren't paying attention to a crucial issue. They said, we got to form a third party whose goal is going to be to publicize the evils of slavery and start to gradually convince people how evil slavery is and that it needs to be abolished. So they formed something called the Liberty Party. Pretty simple. It's called the Liberty Party, right? They wanted to promote liberty and equality and end slavery immediately. Now, they're not going to win. They knew they weren't going to win the presidential election of 1840. But they at least wanted their message out there in the public eye. And I think it's kind of interesting, if you care, that the person that the Liberty Party ran for president in 1840 was a sawmill and logging company owner, a lumber company owner from Bay City, Michigan. The guy had been a slave owner in the South when he was younger, and he decided slavery was evil, so he freed all of his slaves. He moved to the North, he moved to Michigan, opened up some sawmills and some logging companies, and became rich beyond his wildest dreams. And he said, look, I'm proof that you can thrive financially without slavery. And so they ran him as president so he could try to appeal to people and say, look, slavery doesn't have to be the only way we can thrive as a country. We need to end it. He only got a handful of votes, but they said, let's get more involved politically. So this kind of hurt the movement for a while. They couldn't see eye to eye on everything. And it allowed some people to ignore them if they were sort of fighting amongst themselves. But I'll tell you this, wherever an abolitionist stood on these issues, there's one thing they all agreed on. And it's a concept I want to make sure you guys understand. I kind of brought this up when I introduced William Lloyd Garrison. Remember he got sued for saying that a northern factory owner benefited from slavery, even though that factory owner didn't own slaves himself? Abolitionists said there was something, this is them talking, they said there was something in this country called the slave power. Slave owners and their northern allies who stood to gain financially by keeping slavery in America and by keeping slavery strong. And abolitionists believed that that slave power ran this country. They believed that it ran the government. They believed that southern states had more power in Congress because of things like the Three-Fifths Compromise. They believed that northern factory owners had an interest in keeping slavery going. And you'll see later on in the 1840s examples of things that made these people say, look, oh, that proves it. The country is being run by the slave power that wants to keep slavery strong. That's going to come back later, all right? But the bottom line is by 1840, you have a small but growing and really vocal abolitionist movement that's trying to convince Americans that slavery is evil, it needs to stop now, and slaves need equal rights. It's growing. Keep that in mind. But there's something else that's growing at the same time. Because a lot of the abolitionists who were out there speaking against slavery, as we've seen, were women. You know, the Grimke sisters come to mind. And as these abolitionist women started to speak out against slavery, they said, wait a minute, there's a connection to make there. We don't have a lot of rights either, you know? Let me just give you an example. This woman here, one of the most famous women of the 1800s, easily also one of the most famous black women in American history. Sojourner Truth was not her real name. She changed her name as she got older. If you're on a sojourn, that means you're like on a quest or a journey. She says, I'm on a journey, I'm on a quest for the truth. That's the name she took for herself. But Sojourner Truth was born as a slave. And she was actually born in New York State. New York State kept slavery a little bit into the 1800s. And then when New York State ended slavery, she was free. And as she grew up, she started speaking both on how evil slavery was and also on the need for women to get more rights in this country. She says, look, I'm black, or she would have said then, I'm Negro and female, two groups of people that are facing huge discrimination in America. And both of those groups need more rights. So let's go, right? And I'll tell you, if you look at the country at the time, can't read it out, it says, what were men afraid of? Check out this cartoon. I love this cartoon. Look at the expression on the woman's face. And she's going off to vote, right? The caption says election day, right? So it's election day and she's going off to vote. And I just look at the expression on her face and she's saying back to her husband, ha, you've been doing this for years. I'm going to finally go vote like I've been waiting for my whole life. And check out what she's leaving her husband with. 2 screaming babies. Oh, how do I handle it? Dishes need washing. You can see the laundry hanging up to dry outside. Tea kettle's boiling over. The cat looks hungry. There's a broken dish under the floor. And it's like the whole role reversal is going on in this cartoon. And the men are like, oh my God, this is what will happen if women get rights. We might actually have to cook or take care of our kids. Oh, God forbid, you know. But the thing is, women had almost no rights. White, black, women had almost no rights. You couldn't own property as a woman in most states. There are some states that had exceptions, but hey, in a rare case, you could inherit, let's say you could inherit your dad's property if he died and you had no brothers. If you were female and you had no brothers, you could inherit your dad's property. But then if you got married, guess who got that property? Your husband. It became his property. If you got divorced, guess what? He kept it. There is no sense of you deserving to own property. Oh, we also saw this, right? There's not a lot of jobs available for you if you're a woman. Maybe you could be a school teacher. You could work in one of those northern factories, but you didn't get paid much. Oh, and don't forget, a lot of those northern factories made you send your wages home to your nearest male relative, right? Almost no college in the country was going to let you attend class. The idea was women didn't need a college education. They'll work in the factory for a while, and then they'll go home, they'll get married, they'll pop out babies. That was the sexist attitude at the time, all right? Very few colleges enrolled any female students until well after the Civil War. And so some of these women, white and black, said things like this, you know, in striving to cut the slave's irons off, meaning we're trying to free the slave, we found most surely that we were manacled ourselves. A manacle is like a shackle. And we had no rights either. We have to change that. And it's a growing movement. I'll just give you an example of how it's going to play out, right? The quotation up there says unwomanly behavior, and you can't see all of it. The Grimke sisters, who we saw before, you remember they were from the South. They experienced slavery firsthand, right? They also got involved in this women's rights movement. And when they would speak, whether it was against slavery or in favor of women's rights or both, huge crowds came to hear them talk. Sometimes it was like out of curiosity. Oh, women are talking. I got to see this, right? And a couple of times when they would speak, they would get booed. They would have things thrown at them. And in one case, there was a letter that was written to a newspaper in Boston about the unwomanly behavior of the Grimke sisters for speaking in front of these audiences. And the letter said they had no right to speak in front of what they called a promiscuous audience. A promiscuous audience before the Civil War. That didn't mean what you might be thinking. Okay, promiscuous today is a whole different sexual meaning. All right. In this case, it just meant they were talking in front of an audience that was mixed, made up of both men and women. And people said, if they wanted to talk to women, great, we could ignore that. But they are daring to tell men what they think? We can't have that. Scandalize some people. And the Grimke sisters saw this letter and they wrote back, said, forget it, we can do whatever we want. Whatever is right for a man to do is right for a woman. Now, I got to be honest with you. Not every man thought they were crazy. And not every woman supported them. We need to be clear on that, okay? In my career, I've had some female students who think that women should not work outside the home. I've had female students who think that women never should have gotten the right to vote because they think it's destroying the American family. So those attitudes still exist in modern day America. So don't think it was just men against them and women for them. It's a lot more complicated. But I'll show you what really got this movement going, this women's rights movement, just as an example. Remember William Lloyd Garrison, that strong abolitionist? In 1840, Garrison went to the World Anti-Slavery Society Conference in London, England. And remember, England had ended slavery in all of their territories a few years before that, right? So Garrison went, and Garrison, being a fan of women's rights, also took a couple of women with him. You can see them in this picture. This is pictures of them when they were a little older. I don't know if you've ever heard of Elizabeth Cady Stanton or Lucretia Mott. They're two of the most famous women's rights activists or feminists of the 1800s. But Mott, Stanton, and Garrison got to the conference center in London where this meeting was going to happen. And they were told, no, you can't come in. Oh, Mr. Garrison, we're happy to have you here, but the ladies have to stay outside. And Garrison's like, what the heck? You say you're about human rights. You oppose slavery, but you won't let the women attend this meeting? This is terrible. Garrison wouldn't go. He refused. The three of them got on the first ship back to Boston. And when they got back, Stanton and Mott said, we can't wait anymore. We can't even be treated equally at a meeting designed to end discrimination and make people more equal worldwide, then something's got to happen. And these women started meeting nationwide, mostly in the North. I want to stress that, to find ways to get more equality, to get more rights. And easily the most famous example of this was at a conference they held in a town in upstate New York called Seneca Falls. You can visit. There's a big museum on the women's rights movement and women's history in Seneca Falls today. And they got together and held this conference, and it was about how to make the women's rights movement more public, more vocal, how to get more people on their side. And I should mention, at this conference, if you guys know what a gavel is, you know, the hammer that you hold to bang a meeting to order, these women gave the gavel at this women's rights conference to one of their husbands. Not because they thought only a man could run a meeting, but think about how this would be received publicly by Americans who didn't believe in women's rights if it was all women talking to each other. They would say, well, we can ignore them. We don't have to take it seriously. But these women said, oh, if we let one of our husbands run the meeting, that proves that there are men who support our cause. That will make these sexist people out there in America think more about our meeting. If they say, well, it was run by a man, it must be more official. That's what they thought, right? And these women at Seneca Falls published their statement of their views, their statement of their beliefs, the reasons why they felt like women needed more rights in this country. And they called it the Declaration of Sentiments. Here's where this gets interesting to me. We've already talked about another very famous American document with the word declaration in its title. Remember the Declaration of Independence, right? Thomas Jefferson writing about how evil the King of England had been against the colonies before the American Revolution. Well, in that document, Jefferson said, he has done this to us. He has done this to us. He being the king, us being the colonies. In this Declaration of Sentiments, when it said, he has done this to us, he means men. Us means women. And they took the Declaration of Independence and basically reworded it for their own message. So instead of saying all men are created equal, check it out. All men and women are created equal. And it talked about the fact that we don't get to keep our wages when we work in factories. We don't have the right to vote. We can't own property. Here's a kicker. Speaking of the American Revolution, maybe you've heard of this rallying cry from the revolutionaries a generation earlier that said no taxation without representation. Those founding fathers said the British are taxing us, but we have no voice in the government that's taxing us. These women in Seneca Falls said the same thing. We're being told we have to follow all these laws, but we don't get to vote for the representatives that pass those laws over us. We have no voice in this government. Well, how do you get a voice in the government? You get suffrage, which is a fancy way of saying the right to vote. And these women in 1848 were demanding the right to vote. Now, I don't know if you know, they didn't get it right away. They had to wait quite a while. I'm going to go ahead and spoil it. Ooh, spoiler alert, here's how it goes. American women did not get the right to vote nationally until 1920. I don't know if you knew that. Don't take your rights for granted, folks. You have to fight to earn them, and you have to fight to keep them. And in this case, it's going to be quite a few decades before they get the right to vote nationally. But it's an uphill battle, and it's a start. But the thing is, these women's rights meetings were mostly in the North. We've already seen working class Northern women saying they need more rights because they're working in these factories. We've seen middle class Northern women saying, hey, maybe we should have rights because we're telling our husbands what to do about politics and they're listening to us. So maybe we should have the right to vote. In the South, it's different. And we'll look at that next time. We'll look at the way the South is reacting to both of these things. We'll look at Southern women in the South and what they're expected to be like. And most crucially, we're going to take this growing Northern anti-slavery movement, and we have to be fair. We may not like it. It may not be as easy for us in the present day to look at this. But if we're going to be fair and look at this country before the Civil War, we got to look at the Southern reaction to the anti-slavery movement. We've got to let the South tell us why slavery is great. We got to let the South defend slavery. If we let the North attack it, we have to let the South defend it. And that's what we're going to do next time. So we'll see you soon.